You're listening to She's the Business podcast. Hello, so I'm here with Ruth Kent, who is the founder of Sunrise Well. Ruth, welcome to She's the Business podcast.
Thank you very much.
So excited to chat with you today all about, stress and the psychological health of both ourselves and anyone in our teams as well. So before we get into that topic though, could you please tell us a bit more about you and who you serve in your business?
Right. So thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's exciting to talk with you. And so about me, I'm a wellbeing consultant. I work in workplaces, improving employee wellbeing. That can look like many different things. A lot of what I do is around facilitation of workshops. And I'm also moving more into consulting with teams around their business, HR really, around their wellbeing strategy. Yeah, and I've been doing that for about 10 years now.
Amazing. So how did you get into that? What was your background before this?
So it's sort of hard to how long is a piece of string kind of question. But so going back to uni, I think is probably where it all began. So I did psychology at university. I didn't train to be a clinical psychologist at the time. I was not really that interested in it. Towards the end of my degree, I found health sociology, which was really interesting for me. And that's looking at health of groups and the sociology of health in populations. So from there, I studied postgraduate diploma in public health. And so I've been always really interested in sort of group behavior and how we can influence in a positive way to make changes in the health and well-being of people. So it's kind of like marketing, but it's really, in some ways, because there's a lot of psychology behind, why people do certain things, etc. But at the end of those degrees, I got into teaching English. It was sort of like, I was one of those people who I finished my degree and I thought, what am I going to be doing? And I saw, back in the day when you have newspapers and you're looking through jobs, and I saw this advertisement where they would fly me over and pay all these different things and set me up to teach English. So I went over to South Korea and taught English for a little while, taught in Japan, and it kind of really ignited a travel bug for me. So I did a lot of traveling in my 20s. So I did a lot of teaching of English because I became very good at it, as you do when you do a job that again and again. And so I got a lot of skills, which, now looking back, I think, oh, that's good. I got those facilitation skills, working with groups, cultural awareness, just people management, etc. So I sort of, when I look back, I don't regret doing that because I got to travel and I got to develop a lot of skills along the way. I found myself in Sydney. I spent about 10 years in Sydney. And I continued with the teaching, but I moved sort of into the higher education space. And I was around starting to teach as a lecturer or a tutor in health science students who were doing a pathway program to get into university. Yeah. So again, working with groups and teams, etc. But by that time, I knew that I wasn't satisfied because I hadn't kind of lost the health and well-being side of things. I mean, the closest I was getting was working with the health science students, but I wasn't really happy with that. I felt like there was something deeper and something more that I wanted to do. So I spoke with my husband, who was not my husband at the time, and he really encouraged me to start doing more, start doing something different. And I started my business. So that was in around 2014. I started my business that's called Sunrise Well. And I really started to bring in, I guess, the public health and the health population things, but also just that one-to-many type of approach with classes, mindfulness classes, yoga classes. But it still wasn't quite right. So it's kind of funny because around that same time, I had like a huge year. And I think it just really gave me that final push. So when I was kind of doing the business, but I was half doing it. I was sort of not sure where I was going and I was a bit lost. And then I had this year where like all these big events happened and I realized that I was the one who was going to have to like really take the leap. I think I was holding myself back. And it was really, it was just a year that I felt as though, you either do it now or you never do it, and all the things that I was holding myself back with there was no reason to be doing it. I was just really shooting myself in the foot. So, like, briefly, if you want to know.
Yes, I am. I'm waiting to hear what happened. What changed for you?
So actually, now that I think about it, I officially started my business in 2014, but this actually happened in 2013. So I guess I was kind of like umming and ahhing, and, I was sort of really lost with what I was doing. So the events were, I think I had my father's mother and my mother's mother, both of my grandmothers, passed away within 6 months of each other. So that was sort of, we had very strong ties in our family. And so we had this sort of sudden experience, and it was on both sides of the family that we lost my grandmothers. And then in between that time, so I guess I was dealing with the grief of that. And then in between that time, I had two other things happen. The first was sort of randomly, because when you're teaching, you can have quite flexible hours. So I think it was a Tuesday or a Wednesday in the mid-morning, and I stepped out of my house. I was just going to go shopping, pick up some groceries or something. And this was just in Sydney. And is it sort of like a residential area in Sydney, nothing special about the area. So I walked out onto my footpath and I looked across the road and I saw a man face down on the ground, and it was not the kind of area that you would expect to find that kind of thing, if you know what I mean. It wasn't so I saw this man face down, and my brain took a little while to catch up, and I said, what's going on? So I ran across the road. I guess I rolled him over and discovered that he was like seriously ill, and I actually panicked. I really panicked. I didn't know what to do. And I screamed out for help, and I started calling out, and a neighbor ran out, and the two of us, called an ambulance and started CPR. So he needed CPR. So we went through the,
Wow.
CPR checks. And so we started doing the compressions, and this is sort of nothing I expected to ever be doing. And we spent about 20 minutes working on this man until the ambulance arrived. When they arrived, of course, they took over and they restored some semblance of a heartbeat, but they took him to the hospital. Unfortunately, he did pass away. It wasn't enough. But his family contacted me later on and said that they were, I don't know what the word, grateful, I guess, that there was somebody with him, in that moment, and there was someone there to sort of be with him and try to help him through it. So it was a really intense time. They actually, when the ambulance took him, they took me as well, because I was in shock. I wasn't expecting to be going through something like that on a Tuesday morning. Yeah, it sort of definitely stuck with me. I thought I had got over it, but to be honest, it still pops up in my mind. I got to know his partner. She wanted to, I guess it was part of her process that she wanted to have those, someone like me with her. And yeah, so there was that. That was a huge situation. And then a few weeks after that, my husband, who had a congenital heart defect, so he'd been born with a congenital heart defect, he'd had that monitored for his whole life. And for, I don't know why, but it was in that moment a couple of weeks later that his cardiologist said, we're gonna send you in. And it was sort of a Thursday or a Friday, and he said, we're going to send you in. We're going in on Tuesday. So we had like 3 or 4 days for him to prepare for open heart surgery and, everything you have to do after that, which is about like a minimum of 3 months recovery. So we,
Wow.
we were like, okay, so now there's this, which is fine. Like, he was fine. He recovered very, very well. But yeah. And then, not long after that, my grandmother passed away. So this was about 6 months of just this tumultuous sort of time, and very emotional. And I think it gave me a lot of, time for reflection. And that's when the business, for me was like, what am I holding myself back for?
Yeah. I was going to say, like, those kind of experiences, they make you just sit up and realize, we have one life. We're living it right now, and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Like, what are we waiting for? Why aren't we doing the things? What are we afraid of? Because, what if everything changes tomorrow? You just never know. And I guess for you, those moments of like, wow, life's so short, like especially with, you know, the deaths, unfortunately, that happened. But I'm glad to hear your husband got through his heart surgery. But it's, you know, it's nerve-wracking, isn't it? My dad went through open heart surgery when I was young, and, you know, it was significant. And, you know, you just really think, wow, you know, one minute you feel life is just there and nothing's going to happen and we're all invincible. And the next minute you're thinking it's so precious. So I can really see how all of that experience must have just ignited within you this like, why am I holding back? What am I waiting for? Let's just do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then interestingly as well, I guess that whole piece around wellness and health, I guess you can't help to draw the connections between that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, when we say wellness, you know, it's such a broad term. You know, what is it specifically around wellness that you think, you know, what is your focus area? What do you believe is the most important aspects to be focusing on, and why?
It's a good question. Look, for me, I prefer to call it wellbeing. And my concept of that is that it's a whole being approach. It's not, there is no specific one thing in wellness that for me is going to cover or, you know, tick all the boxes. So it's, for me, it's really around approaching it as the entire person, and that's not just the person, but everything within their field. So that's their environment, the people with them, their relationships, everything. Yeah, so I can't give you a specific thing because for me it's everything.
Yeah. That's okay. I think that was what was sort of happening in the back of my mind. So I'll go back and unwrap that and then leave that to you to take forward. But, you know, you're talking about running workshops and facilitating wellbeing programs for businesses. And having come from corporate, I'm very familiar and aware with, you know, the types of things and you know, I guess from a business's point of view, they want to be seen to be looking after their employees. And so it's like a great tick box for HR in that. But, you know, I was like, well as it being a tick box, it's a lot more than that. Like there's so much that can be changed when we have people who are healthy, who are functioning well. So, you know, maybe a question to ask you would be, what do you see as the most significant issues that are popping up with people in the workplace that are contributing to a lack of well-being that you're then focusing on helping these companies to resolve?
So, yeah, that's a great question as well, because there are some trends that they just keep coming up and up, you know, again and again. And the biggest one really is around stress, which shouldn't really be a surprise. But, you know, we got through the pandemic, anxiety and stress were very, very high. Well, you know, technically we're through the pandemic, and anxiety and stress were predicted to be higher for many people in general because of the situation. But you know, as we pass through that curve of high infection rates and pandemic and all the things that went along with it, stress and anxiety continue to be high. And there's some interesting things going on there, specifically around, you know, as we were sort of talking off camera about, was around this idea of, you know, where do you work? And some businesses have really started to push people to go back into the office. And it's an interesting conversation that's going on right now on whether do we really need to be in the office and what happens with productivity when people aren't going to the office versus when they are going to the office, just as an example. And then we've got certain businesses that are really trying to push people back into that space. And there are certainly benefits for it, for people to be in that space at times. And yet the contrast to that is that for some people, there are no benefits to going in. And in fact, it creates more stress for them. These could be families with young kids who, you know, have a big juggle in the mornings. And so there's the transport issues there, or even just getting that extra hour of time to look after themselves. So those are the sorts of things that come up in the conversations that we have around, you know, how can we actually support people psychologically there, you know, to be able to put in a good working day, but still feel, you know, reduction in stress. I don't think we'll ever eliminate stress, and it's not necessarily a thing that we want to do. We all need to function with a certain amount of stress in our lives, but minimizing the stress, and many workplaces now have that, they have that obligation to do that. So those are the sorts of conversations that we have. And then, just supporting people sometimes in workshops, for example, around their stress management. It can be around even things like setting up their boundaries, having conversations with the people that, in their team, their managers, around what am I able to produce in this period of time, empowering people, I guess, to have the confidence and the structure and the communication skills to be able to have those conversations. It can also be around leaders and the ability for them to develop their emotional intelligence or their empathy so that they can have conversations around well-being where they're actually going to have honest and true and trustworthy kind of responses, or trusting responses, where people are able to be vulnerable and have real conversations. So there are many different things that we look at. At the end of the day, it's like you said, HR, they want to, or the leaders, they want people to feel happy at work. They also want them to feel productive at work and to be able to do a good day's work. But, having gone through what we've gone through, I think we also need to balance what people need, which is different for everyone.
Yes, so much so, isn't it? It's so interesting, like even just thinking back over, our own lifetime and career and how what it felt like. And I won't say I knew what the executive team were thinking when I first started out in my first job. You really just felt like, you're there to do a job, you're an employee, there are expectations, and while they obviously want you to be successful in your role, I don't know if it extended that far to your personal well-being and health. It was more like, are you doing the job that you're hired to do? And that was kind of it. Whereas now it's like, there's so much more understanding and knowledge and awareness of, the productivity is so linked to how a person feels and, psychological pressures and stresses, which, it's much more understood and known now, which is fantastic. I think my kids are really lucky growing up in this place. I'm not sure what it'll be like once they're working, but it's only improving from here. I wanted to ask, stress is something I think everyone can relate to. We all have felt it. What do you think is, the real impact or dangers of not being able to manage your stress? And I wanted to ask that from a business owner perspective, as well as just yourself in your life, because there are, I think stress is just so common, and it's almost like we just deal with it on a daily basis. Like it's always there, it's always present. So now it just becomes, that's just the way it is. I'm always busy, I'm always stressed. But what might we be negatively impacted by or experiencing by just letting it be the status quo?
I guess what's happening is when we're moving into the stress response, it's going to go, either way. It's sort of without going into all the physiology of it, but if we move into the stress response and it's actually an adaptive situation, like we actually need that little kick of adrenaline to get us through a situation, like doing a presentation or, maybe having a tough meeting with someone. Sometimes that type of thing can be quite helpful, so it gives you that little boost, that little bit of adrenaline to get through the situation. But the issue is that it's kind of an interplay between what our brains are doing and what our bodies are doing. But what tends to happen is that we get into these spaces of high stress in a chronic state. So rather than having these little short bursts of stress response and then kind of coming down from that, moving back into a more adaptive rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system response, what we tend to do is we continue moving our bodies through this heightened sympathetic nervous response, which people call the fight, flight, freeze situation. And so we're perpetually initiating this response within our body. So our body is continually pumping out adrenaline and cortisol. And over time, that is having a big effect on our physiology. So just starting there, that's one thing that, our bodies, like I said, we can go into this state, but we need to come back out of it. And we can't be in this state 24 hours or, the entire working day. And then, for many people, I know I have two small children. So you have the working day and then you've got just trying to get dinner on the table, and the stress that goes along with that, because I've got these little hungry mouths coming up to me every 5 minutes asking for snacks because dinner's, taking an hour. And there's just this constant state of stress that we're putting ourselves through. So some of the things that starts to happen when we are engaging that physiology is we're doing things like we're constantly moving blood away from and sort of engagement away from our digestive system. So, a lot of people will talk about things like IBS and digestive complaints and the relationship with stress, the connection with that and our blood flow around what happens in our skin. So a lot of people can develop skin issues, things like psoriasis, and just even if they've already got them, there's this exacerbation of them. So things like that. And then going even deeper into muscular issues, tension that we hold in our bodies, teeth grinding is a big one. So tension in the jaws, and of course, heart problems and cardiovascular problems. So those are just some of the things that, long-term are having an effect on our physiology. And then you add in, when we're getting stress and tension in our body and we're getting headaches and we are not stopping and pausing and looking after ourselves physically or emotionally, then of course it goes without saying that we start to take it out on people around us, and yelling, shouting at people is a way of releasing the valve. It's not positive. It's not great, but it is a way for us to release tension, which is an ineffective way to, get rid of that stress. So what we tend to do is become shorter with people, more irritable. We don't sleep as well. Obviously, when we're thinking a lot, sometimes it starts to interrupt our night times as well, and we're waking up and having sleep issues as well. So, and it's sort of this cycle where if you don't sleep enough and you're not really at your best, you don't really have the energy to deal with the stress, and you don't have the energy to deal with the people around you. So then it perpetuates and you end up sort of, this cycle just keeps on going. So those are some of the things, and I see, like I said, whole being. So I see it as workplace, home life. It's all integrated. What's going on at home, it's affecting you at work. What's going on at work for most people affects them at home. So
it's incredible, isn't it? And you just start to think stress is like this invisible thing that's happening kind of within our minds, and then how the body is responding. And, I was just thinking as you were talking about things like skin complaints and, stomach digestion issues, you go to the doctor and they prescribe you medication for it. But it's like, well, actually, it's probably just more how you're dealing with life right now and what can we do to lower that stress. I wanted to ask a bit about, particularly if you're running a business, clearly it's not great if you're, perpetuating the stress and feeling in that state. What else might be happening, that's not helping you? What would you be recommending to somebody, the dangers of not addressing stress and not sort of taking this seriously enough?
You mean for someone at work or someone at home or both? Or
well, if you're running a business, I guess, you are the person who's in charge. While you have, the impact of your own stress on the business and not just on yourself, because obviously, that's important, like incredibly important. You are running the business. So if you get taken out with stress and actually become really ill, then that's not great. But on a day-to-day basis, it could be having an impact as well. And I've heard people talk about your brain function when you're in that stress response, and what you might be unintentionally doing within your business, purely just because you're sitting in that stress response.
Yeah, so obviously burnout's a big one, so that can be that long-term consequence of just not listening and just keep going. And then your body just says, nope, that's it. But just in the day-to-day, it's really, when we go into the stress response, what tends to happen is we get this tunnel vision. So we tend to, and this is any kind of really, I guess, many negative states that we go into, we tend to not have literally open peripheral vision. So we tend to tunnel our vision in and our hearing in, which isn't another adaptive response to stress. But what that can tend to do, obviously, is just even literally not being able to have that open awareness of things going on in your day to day. So I think for many business owners, you kind of need to have a bit of a creative edge when you're doing your work. You need to sort of have the, I guess, the brain width, the brain space to know what you're doing in that moment, but also be able to be across everything else. And when you're going into the stress response and you have that tunnel vision, there's a danger in losing that creative input that you really need. So your brain really starts to go offline in terms of the executive functioning. We tend to not be able to make decisions as clearly, and that's really because you're engaging that fight-flight response, which takes you out of the prefrontal cortex. So your area where you're able to be clear, have, well thought through plans, be less impulsive, all that starts to go offline when you get into that stress state and you become way more reactive. And so when you're reactive with your actions, you're reactive with your, verbally with people and your interactions. So you're kind of losing in many areas because you might not be performing as well, but you also might not be working with your clients as well, or the people that you're dealing with, and of course your team. So yeah, many effects can happen there.
Yeah, and that can obviously make you feel even more stressed if you're seeing that the results are going down. So just to paraphrase, if you're finding yourself in this place where you're noticing that you're overthinking, struggling to make decisions, maybe making decisions and then in hindsight seeing that maybe they weren't the best decisions, all of these things that you've just described, if you're noticing that, then it's a sign that it's probably because you're in a stress response and your brain isn't functioning how it could be. So what are we best to do once we've identified that is going on? Like, what kind of things can we do that are really simple to, help ourselves get out of that place and get back to a place of calm and being able to logically make a decision? What would you suggest?
There's many different ways that you can approach it. So first of all, is I think taking a step back and looking at what's going on and whether you are, whether you're taking on too much, and obviously having a look at your workload, having a look at what needs to be delegated, all of those sorts of things, being very clear with what you can do and honest with yourself about what you can actually take on. And so getting into that more of the strategy side of things, I think is an important thing to remember and to do. But when you're stuck in the day-to-day and you find yourself in that stress response, what you want to do is have a bit of a toolkit. That's the way I look at it, a bit of a toolkit to call on. So you want to have your supportive practices that you do every day, and those sorts of things, I guess, give you the buffer to not get as stressed. You're kind of building it into your daily practices. So those sorts of things are around, getting good night's sleep, having some kind of physical movement, some kind of exercise, having, if you want to have some kind of spiritual or mindfulness practice of some kind, really having that time to journal or check in with yourself. So those sorts of practices around just the supportive well-being and building that buffer. At the same time, when you're actually in the stress response, you also want to have a few things like handy and ready to go. And that's really around closing the stress cycle. So if you find that if you go through any kind of stressful moment in your day and you find yourself kind of heightened and your heartbeat's racing and you've got stress and tension and you're sweating a little bit and, you find yourself in that moment, then having a few things that that will work to bring that stress cycle back down and close the loop is what they call it. So, something like go for a walk, get outside and get moving, have a hug. Actually, that's a good one, like a really long hug, as long as the other person is happy to do that. A nice long hug, because that, changes the neurotransmitters in your body. You've got things like some breathing exercises if they work for you. So taking some belly breaths, or if you've got a particular breathing exercise, there's one called the box breathing. It's really great for managing anxiety. Yeah, so just, having a dance shaking it off, getting that stress adrenaline out of your body is another thing for some people. Really, they're really built up with energy. They can't sit and do breathing. They're better off getting up and doing a dance or going for a walk or a run. So everyone's going to be different, but you just kind of figure out what might work for you and having them ready to go. And it doesn't have to take long. It can take a couple of minutes and that's it. And you're just closing that cycle and getting your body back down again into the parasympathetic nervous system.
That's really great. And I think that you mentioned something that is worth just talking about for a moment, because you said it's about sort of setting expectations and being clear about what you can take on and what you can't. And, I think this is relevant for everyone, whether you're owner of the business or an employee. And I remember realizing that at one stage during my career, I was like, well, they will just keep on asking me to do more and more and more. I actually have to tell them what can be done and what can't be, or get them to choose what is the priority. So that was something that I learned. But I think that when you're a high achiever, entrepreneurial types, I think we're really motivated, we're really driven. You've started a business, you've got a lot of vision, and it's exciting, and there's things that you want to do. We want it all done now, like not or yesterday. I think that's the thing, is it can feel like that, and it can feel frustrating at the speed at which you're going. And so I know from my own experience, I'm a classic person for giving myself, thinking, yeah, I can do that, or I can fit that in, and, like adding in ideas and thinking that just seems really easy, because in the moment when I'm thinking about it in my brain, it does seem really simple and easy. And then when you actually start breaking down, well, what are all the steps required to make this happen? It starts to be like, oh my God, and I've got to get it done. And now I've committed to it. And, I'm always someone who stands by my word. So when you commit to something, I'm all in. And I can imagine that that's something a lot of people experience as well. It's certainly been huge for me in, like you, I had some things that happened in life that kind of forced me to say, okay, you're going to have to let go of some of the stuff that you're doing in your business. You're going to have to strip things down. You're going to need to streamline and cut off some of the bits. And that was like, I had to make those decisions. It was difficult. But the difference once you do, it's like you've released all of this pressure that actually you're putting on yourself, aren't you? Because you're the boss. This is your business. You're deciding what you're doing. And so one of the things that I find so funny sometimes when we're stressed in our own business, and I love to ask someone, I'm like, so whose deadline is this that you are trying to meet? And they're like, well, it's the date that I've set. And I said, and who is going to know if you don't hit that date? Who is actually who is the boss here? And, obviously it comes back to, well, it's me, it's my own deadline. And, but it's this kind of behavior that we've built up from the times where we were an employee of needing to meet a deadline and, it must be met, that then we're extending into our own business, and we're giving ourselves self-imposed deadlines and expectations that we then get stressed out about meeting, when actually nothing is going to happen if you don't meet it. Like, move the date, shift it, decide it's not that important, and actually get really good at saying no. And I think that can have such a big impact just on your day-to-day. And, I just wanted to share, I guess, that it can feel hard to simplify and feel like you're scaling down, but scaling down your business doesn't mean that it's becoming smaller. It's actually giving you more opportunity to grow it. Ironically, by doing less, you can create more because you're focused on less things and you're not in so many different places and scattered and needing to jump from one thing to another. You can really do what you're doing better. And, I just think that was such an important point you made of like actually just setting those boundaries and being really realistic with yourself about what you can do. And even if it's a great idea, should you be doing that right now? Like, you can still do it. Maybe you put it on the list to do next quarter or next year or whenever is going to be, practical for you. And I'm not saying slow down and don't do anything, don't take action, but it's like, well, we should be taking the most important actions right now and not all of the other stuff that we've got great ideas about, but being totally unrealistic in terms of the resource that you have. So,
yeah. I totally agree. Yeah. And it's so, I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur, but as a business owner, I've had to rein myself in so many times where I've gone off on that shiny object syndrome, going off and thought, oh, that's great. And, getting myself tangled up in things that were way more work than I expected, or totally not in the direction I really wanted to go when I sat back and had a look. And I think that's the other thing that we tend to get when we're stressed out. We tend to reach for the fastest, easiest and shiniest object. And it's not necessarily great business strategy. So yeah, sometimes helpful to step back and take a pause and like you said, scale down and focus.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, one of the other little things that helped me was being able to write, 3 action items the day before, or, on a Sunday or a Friday, whenever, before the week's starting. So it's not like, right, I'm starting work, open up the laptop and start just diving into whatever's in front of your face, because you'll end up with 50 tabs open, things everywhere, you're responding to emails, there's all this stuff going on. You'll finish the day feeling like you've just run a marathon. And what have you actually got done? Like, you actually might have just been keeping the status quo, but not really doing anything that's going to shift anything forward. And that's the real danger of doing that. And I think that was, I can't remember where I heard that one from, and it's probably well known by now, but just taking that time, even if it's before the day starts, while you're having breakfast, what are my 3 top priorities for the day before I even look at anything else that's come in? Is that can kind of keep you focused on what's actually important versus what's in front of you right now. I'm definitely not someone that subscribes to the inbox zero mentality, because I learned a long time ago that if it's really important, they will contact you again.
Yeah.
So I'm fine with my inbox being full of unread emails. That's not important. But I wanted to ask you, in terms of, as a business owner, we often have people who are working with us or for us, whether they're employees or contractors. Clearly, you've mentioned about when we're in this state of stress, how it's impacting our thinking and our behavior. How do you, I guess, help not add stress to your team? How do you help them? Because they will obviously be managing their own stress themselves. But I think as a business owner, we have to be really mindful of what stress are we creating or sending out to others. And are there any insights or tips that you have around how we can create a working environment that is really conducive to productivity and people feeling empowered, and also just not having that stressful relationship where maybe the expectations are not being met?
So there's a couple of ways to look at this. The one that's like super important is just around psychosocial hazard management. And so that's newish kind of legislation that's come in. And I think, many businesses should know about it by now, but perhaps some of the smaller businesses have not really heard about it. And that's really around the same as we have workplace health and safety around our physical safety. We also have legislation protecting workers around their psychological safety. So what we need to do as business owners is ensure that you can actually go through sort of hazard management, like risk management planning and assessment, and just making sure that you're minimizing those situations that might create stress or create harm psychologically to people. And that depends on the workplace, but it's things around what I kind of mentioned earlier around job scope, for example, making sure that the job that people have signed up to do is actually what they're doing, and it hasn't crept into becoming more than what they expected, and having clarity around what their roles actually are, the workplace pressure and the deadlines, etc., making sure that that's manageable for people. So as a business owner, we do need to be responsible for those things. Obviously, things around bullying, toxic relationships, trauma. So if you have people who work in the front line at all, or they're working with, public facing and maybe experiencing situations that might give or create trauma, minimizing the risks around that. So there's that side of it. And then, it's when you asked about what kinds of, how can we create an environment where we can empower people to look after themselves. For me, that's around psychological safety, which is a different concept. They sound the same, but they are different. So psychological safety it comes from Amy Edmondson. I guess she coined the term. This was a little while ago, at least 20 years ago, I think. I'll have to check the date. But anyway, so she coined this through her research around, workplaces that have employees who are happier and more productive and feel safe to voice concerns or voice ideas as well, or worries or anything along those lines. They feel safe to do so, and that empowers them to speak up basically without punishment. So, if we look sometimes at the traditional workplaces and traditional models, you've got the boss or you've got the leader, and what they say goes, and the employees just do what they say, and they can't speak up. They can't really voice any ideas. And so what happens is that people start to repress or hold on to those things, and that obviously can create harm. There might be some issues going on within the team, and people are not feeling safe to voice those issues, and this can then exacerbate the issue, and it can just grow and create a larger toxic environment. Or it could be things around just feeling empowered and safe enough to voice thoughts or opinions. So there's there's plenty of them now, but there's one famous example of a company called Alcoa in the US. And when the new CEO stepped in, his name was Paul O'Neill. He was brought in to improve productivity and to increase the revenue of the business. But he surprised everyone by saying, we're going to focus on having a zero injury workplace. So this was I think it was some kind of manufacturing plant. So they did have a number of injuries. What he wanted to do was create a psychologically safe environment where the workers felt empowered and encouraged to speak up every time they thought there was a process or an issue going on that might cause an injury. And what they did was they dramatically decreased the number of injuries. But interestingly, because the people were so engaged and because the work was not causing injuries and people were feeling more productive in general, the revenue increased incredibly. I think I've read something like it quintupled. So revenue increased. He wasn't focusing on the revenue. He was focusing on creating an environment where people felt safe to speak up and voice their concerns. So it can have a big impact on productivity, but it also creates an environment where people want to be. They want to work there. They want to work in a place where they feel supported and empowered. It can also create opportunities for innovation, creativity. People feel safe enough to voice like, hey, what if we tried it like this? And it might not work, but you get new ideas and you get things on the table that you might not have thought of. So
yeah, I can definitely see what an amazing story and so good. And I've certainly experienced a workplace where it wasn't good to speak up. If it wasn't the CEO's idea, then no idea was worthy. So,
yeah.
It's so true. I think just how you feel about, being valued and being in a place where it is safe to speak and to share ideas. You just never know what you're missing out on if people aren't able to share, right? So good. Wow. This has been such a great conversation, Ruth. I was just wondering if you had anything that you wanted to leave people with, a final tip, something that they can maybe start with today if they're wanting to start addressing this in their own life and business now.
So there's many different ways. For me, I would suggest it helps to have conversations, to speak with somebody, whether that's like a partner, a spouse, or a friend, or a coach, or whoever, to talk through what's going on right now and where that person wants to be. I also really encourage journaling on that type of thing so that there is that ability to get it out of your head and onto paper. So I would encourage people to start those sorts of things where there's some self-reflection to start with, and then from there building up a list of what's my go-to, and having them ready, even having them up on your screen, up on the wall, to say this is my list, this is what I want to have as my stress cycle completion breakers, the breakers of
go for a walk.
the stress.
So it's like,
put it up in bold letters up there.
Yeah.
And feel free obviously to reach out to me and have conversations as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. So where can people best find you, Ruth?
So I spend most of my time now on LinkedIn. You can find me by my name, Ruth Kent, or you can go to my business, Sunrise Well. It's there as well. Or you can find me on Instagram as well. I don't spend as much time there. It's all, a lot of posts are there, but I tend to hang out in LinkedIn and happy to have conversations there. And I think I already sent to you, I have a little course that people are welcome to join. It's an effective course if you sort of have already been to one of my workshops. I tend to give it to people after my workshops, but it's a great course for helping you to sort of get through your values and your motivations. So really helping you to get clear on what sort of steps you want to take and making a plan for managing your stress. So we don't really go into what stress is or, the physiology and that type of thing. We just talk about, getting your plan together so that you walk away with a bit of a plan for yourself to help manage your stress.
Yeah, love that. Oh, that sounds really good, because I think it's like, right, where do you start with journaling and figuring all this out? But if you've got it in a course and you can go through and follow the steps, that sounds like a really great way to get your stress management plan in place and have your go-tos all ready so that you know how to get yourself back out of that really quickly. Yeah, super valuable. Thank you so much. I'll make sure that that's in the show notes, so you can dive below, grab the link to Ruth's course. It's free, isn't it? You said?
Yeah. That one's free. Yeah, absolutely.
Free of charge. Well, there is no reason why not to do it. So grab that one now, connect with Ruth on LinkedIn, and thank you so much. I appreciate your time with us today, Ruth. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to talk with you.